Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price.
And I'm Eric. And today we're going to talk about the Acolyte System in Birthright. So each faction or each class is going to have 5 unique units that are called Acolytes. Typically they are power 3 and they each have a unique ability in their repertoire.
Right. And this is important because they represent mini leaders. So from a thematic standpoint, I've mentioned that Final Fantasy was a very big inspiration for this game, but it's not the only one. There are several, one of which is Ogre Battle 64. And if you've played it before, you know that your squad consists of story characters and non-story characters. To represent this, there's always going to be the class leader, the highest ranked unit, and then there are lower ranked units who would represent, just kind of the generic characters who are there. But then there are those story characters who are recruitable, who are always very interesting and special. And I wanted to encapsulate that in the Acolytes. They're meant to be mini leaders that are interesting, that clearly tell you the direction that the class is trying to go, while offering a lot of versatility in how that goal is going to be implemented. And one of the most interesting things about it is that there are special interactions with the Acolytes, starting with the draft. At the start of the game, you're actually going to take one Acolyte from each class, so I can construct my team completely different than if you were to construct it, even if we were playing the same lineup.
Yeah, so who you draft, I believe, is very much a personality test.
Right.
So, for example, one faction, my favorite faction, the Scouts, has a guy named Marco, and I always pull Marco because he's just, the answer is always Marco, regardless of what the question is.
Right. And it's funny because, you talk about a personality test, it's definitely true. Looking at the statistics, we've seen some very interesting things because we track who's drafting who, in the primary and in the secondary, what are the counts. And there are definitely some patterns forming. I think that there are at least 3 distinct ways of drafting. There's the Eric way, the Jim way, and then the normal way. So why don't you talk a little bit about the Eric way?
So for the most part, regardless of who I'm playing with, I always pick a particular leader or acolyte per faction. So with Cavalry, it's always Simplar. Sleipnir, thank you. Sleipnir, because he has the ability to draw extra cards if you get movement onto his base. And then for Scouts, it's Marco, because he allows you to play units or deploy units that are stationed on the top of your deck. And so factions like that, I just know, I know who their strongman is. I can pull them and I can utilize them from the very start of the game, which is critical to my play style. Why don't you tell me your style?
Right. So I should carry out this by saying that while I would want every Acolyte to be good and of equal value, they're all providing unique value. My general goal is to make it so that at least 3 are legitimate draft targets. You wouldn't want like one auto draft and then everybody else, because that really would dilute the aspect of the system. I can't force people how to draft. But for me, very often I will draft someone and they will stay in my hand until they are ready. Meaning I don't want to miss out on not having this person. It's a big deck. There's 50 cards. You'll draw a lot of cards, but you're not going to see everything. I'll basically say, who is one person that I know I'm going to use at a critical moment, and I want to make sure that I have access to them at that moment. And so I'll draft someone, and they'll just stay there, and then it'll be like, this is the time, boom, I'll go. In the Scouts example, the example might be Jox, because Jox gets temporary power on an attack, which is an on-play ability. You have a lot of Scout deployments. I would never want to waste that on a bad deployment.
Yeah.
I want him to be saying, this is the moment where I need a big drop, and he's there. And, I'll often draft him. Now, that's if I feel like that's what the deck is trying to get me to do. But I'll draft Marco on occasion. I'll draft Vasco, maybe even some of the others, depending on who I'm facing. So I'm much more of the reserved, wait until the exact moment. Now, the normal way is somewhere in between, where people are looking for the engine, what gets me going, what's going to give me consistency, and they'll think like, card draw is really good, or this person's going to grow over time. The point is that you are allowed complete control over how you want your game to start. And because of that, there actually is no mulligan rule.
Yeah.
So in other games, you might say if you have a bad hand, and in Smash Up this manifests as if you have no minions, but that's impossible because you start with 2 units at the start of the game and you chose them, so they should be good. You know, if you don't like your hand, large part of that is on you.
You have no one to blame but yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's just really interesting because they represent a lot of that initial direction that you're going to be getting.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it's really interesting because acolytes are used in more ways than just drafting and uniqueness of the engine. Thematically, one thing that I like is Scroll of Summoning, where you basically kill an acolyte and bring in a leader that matches that faction's leader type.
Right.
Which is interesting because usually only the primary has a leader, except the exception with so far is fairies, where you have Oberon for the leader of the fairies, even though they're a secondary. I think fairies are a really unique case study for the Acolyte system because they all have a secondary faction type.
A secondary rank, yeah.
Rank, thank you.
And there will be factions that have multiple leaders, which makes Scroll of Summoning very interesting. But the idea from a deck construction, we have this concept of a rank, and there are 5 ranks. The top rank is the leader, and you know, for the most part, there's only one. The leaders are powerful. They're meant to drive the faction. From a design perspective, you look at the leader, you should get a good idea of what this faction is trying to do. But then the Acolytes actually rank second, despite the fact that they typically have lower power than the elites, who are the 4 squad. And that's because, you know, they are not just their power, but their ability, and there are a lot of engine abilities. The Acolytes are designed to very often work together as pieces of a puzzle. An example that would call to mind would be, you know, we'll use the Scout example actually. We have Francisco, who can rearrange cards in the deck. The Scouts have a lot of deck foresight, but they don't necessarily have deck manipulation. Francisco being the exception, that he could rearrange cards. Now, all of a sudden, you know, you look at the top cards of your deck and you see that there's no unit there. Francisco's like, wait a second, let's go ahead and switch them up. Now Marco says, oh look, it's a unit, and it can go. So there's definitely a strength in numbers type of feel, and that's the type of interaction that can occur even if they're on separate bases. So another example would be the Thieves with Parker and Barrow, which is a reference to Bonnie and Clyde. They have contrasting abilities. One can give you free cloaking, the other can give you free uncloaking, and then they could also discard cards to do the opposite. But they work in tandem, and they give you a bonus for uncloaking, so that, you know, they're stronger together, even though there is a localized aspect of their ability. It's really fun from a design perspective because, you know, I typically start with the Acolyte first. It's what you're getting, your secondary, that's, you know, 5 out of 15 cards in your secondary, so you want your Acolytes to be strong, working together, but also able to potentially deliver value by themselves. I think that leads to consistency of play. It makes it so that they could fit in well with whatever you're trying to be doing, and just some really good card interactions.
Yeah, and they add a uniqueness of the game. So instead of just having 4 units, 4 types of units, you know, and they're all doing one thing, I really like the uniqueness of the Acolytes because it adds so many more variables. You know what I mean? Imagine if they were all the same ability, how plain that would be, you know?
Now, unfortunately, it is a little bit expensive because we want these Acolytes are people. When you look at your actual class construction, the leader is definitely a person with a unique name. The other ranked units who repeat, they're non-unique in the sense that they might be a decoy, an informant, or a smuggler. They represent, you know, some type of rank or job within the actual class. But the Acolytes represent a person. They have a unique artwork, they have a unique name, they have a unique ability. And yeah, it gives you that real interesting interaction because you don't necessarily know what you're going to be getting. You have to account for, you know, instead of just 4 abilities per class, you know, the primary one has 9 potential abilities that you can get. Which one are you going to get? If you could only save 1 unit, which one are you going to take?
Yeah. Yep. It's really it's fun to play. And that you know, we're talking about when the game comes out, there's going to be what, 88?
88 unique possible
88 unique possibilities. But if you amplify that with what you draft, the variations come out. Oh my God, there's so many more variations at that point because who you draft can really determine how your game plays at that point. You know what I mean?
Right.
Granted, there's still, you know, same card setup, but whether you get more draw cards at the beginning, whether you use your starting Acolyte to do a quick burst at the beginning to kind of put the other player on a offensive, the need to get back on bases and force them to maybe not focus so much on their engines or whatever. It's really interesting.
And I think that this manifests itself in the form of some of the more antagonistic acolytes. So if you have an acolyte who is designed to deal damage, you know, that is going to completely divert someone's playstyle. You might say, all right, that guy needs to die, and I'm going to focus on killing him off.
And you spend 2, maybe 3 turns if you pair a fighter with a cleric.
Right. So it's like, all right, that person, we need them out of the way. It creates that instant pressure. Or some acolytes might not be ready. You can get an acolyte to provide good value, but they may not provide their optimal value over the course of the game. So an example of this might actually be Fina, who is the very high draft target for the clerics. What Fina does is allows you to search your deck for a construct and put it into your hand. And the clerics have a number of constructs that are very useful, but the constructs typically are stronger when there's more of them out. So you can start your game with a guaranteed construct, and there's a lot, like there's a mini conversation there where, all right, now that I've chosen my acolyte, which construct do I want to go for with that acolyte?
Right, because it's like you're almost a free second draft of a action,
right,
know, of another card.
And people will disagree on what to take there, which I think is great.
Yeah.
But you know,
I mean, they can disagree. They can be wrong, but they can disagree.
Right. So
Well of Light.
I mean, Well of Light's great, but it's it relies on having units at full strength. And so if you don't have the healing potential, you might get one charge on Well of Light, and then it just does nothing for the rest of the game and just hangs out there. But you know, later on, when you're looking for that finishing touch, and it's like, all right, now I've got Well of Light and I've got Healing Ward, I can heal my guys, all my guys are at full strength, now I can do this, I can charge Veil of Silence. It's really interesting. Like, I don't fault anybody who wants to start the game with an acolyte like that, but you know, drafting Briok so that you can get a cure going and you have access to instant curing and you have access to his recursion ability, that's really great. A lot of people will take Declan because he's a surprise play that appears out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I was so excited about this aspect of the game because it's where the personality shines through. When you have a pre-constructed deck game, one of the pitfalls of it is that the game kind of tells you how to play itself. Like, this is the strategy for the deck. But when you're actually choosing how you want to work within that strategy, factions have 2 or 3 game plans typically. There's a lot of depth to them. There's 30 cards in a primary faction, but there's so much that's contained in these 5, and you have your choice over how you want the faction to go. It's been very enriching for me, and it really makes it so that people think a lot about the game before it even begins. When you combine that with the royal items that you take, and you know, you really feel like you have control of your deck despite the fact that it's above average in terms of size.
Yep. So, question for you. Who is your favorite acolyte?
I should have known that you were probably going to ask me this. I'm going to have to think about this for a second. Because it's really hard, because I have a very strict love them or lose them philosophy, that if I don't love them, what are they doing in this game?
So they have to meet a certain threshold to even get in the game, and because they meet that threshold, you're in love with them.
Okay, I know what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. It's Vasco. I think it's Vasco. Because, number one, people will look at him and be like, what? Like, they don't get it. Because he's got a very unique ability. I'll just tell you what it is. So he has 2 aspects to the ability. The first is the advantage, where he can be the first unit on a battlefield if you don't have one there. So you can get him for a free play to start your engine, and this is great because it's, you know, a free 2 power, it's a free extra unit quantity, and the scouts care about unit quantity. So he's a way of jump-starting that on a base, which is very good. But the second part of the ability is that at nightfall, he can be returned to your hand. And a lot of people will be like, well, why would you do that? what he actually does is give you guerrilla-like warfare style of playing, where if there's a battlefield that benefits from having presence, specifically on play, you can throw him down there. He can play there. You can get the benefit, and then you can pull him back to avoid power creep. If it looks like he's going to die, you can pull him back. So he can act like a decoy, no pun intended, because there's a decoy in the scouts. He's just so flexible. You could even just play him to get him out of your hand to pull him back, because he comes back after the point at which you've discarded. He's so flexible. Typically, people will be like, I don't get this card at all. And then they start using him, and they're like, I love Vasco. He's amazing. I do all these things with him. Yeah. And so, it's really enriching for me, because, it's not apparent what you would do with this card. Then you start playing the game, and you realize that he has so much potential, and there's so many things you can do. He can be used to pre-charge other cards, because there might be certain effects that require a unit to be there, and he can be that unit, and then you can pull him back.
I was playing a fantastic game last night where playing with my wife, and she put Vasco for the first time on a base, pivoted with 2 decoys over to that base, and then used a smuggler who had a movement ability to move onto that base. The smuggler then deployed on that base, and then she had 3 maneuvers still.
Right.
Which was like, okay, so you did all that, and you have how many maneuvers left? Oh, all of them.
Right.
Okay, cool. So now what are you going to do now that you just had a 15 power swing right there?
Right.
And it was just phenomenal.
And that's part of his advantage, that if you want access to that type of burst, you can get it. It means foregoing Marco, which you're never going to do, but you have that option. And I've drafted Vasco more than Marco, and so I guess it's kind of rooting for the underdog. It's a special type of ability. It's not straightforward, and that's why it's he's my favorite, at least in the core set. But now I'm going to turn the tables on you. Same question. Who's your favorite?
Well, as I said earlier, the answer is always Marco, regardless of what the question is.
It's interesting because he can miss all the time, but the whole point of the scouts is that you know what's coming, so you shouldn't be missing.
Yeah. Especially throw that with some bases like Eagle's Nest or...
Right.
There's just so many possibilities of what you can do to determine what you have on top of your deck.
So if you like the ability to customize your game plan even before the game begins, I think you're really going to enjoy the Acolyte system. There are some special surprises that will be coming with Acolytes later on, well after the core set. I can't talk about them yet, but I want to get people excited about the fact that this is a core part of the game's identity. It's definitely a big part of its value proposition. When we talk about deck customization, you can choose your royal items, you can choose your starting Acolytes, and you get to jumpstart your strategy however you want.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on this little quick snippet of Acolytes. Let's
shut it down.